Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the chess game of the century, and it was played between Donald Byrne and Bobby Fischer. Now, most of you are probably familiar with Bobby Fischer, one of the greatest chess minds of all time. You may not have heard about Donald Byrne. You may have seen this game before. Donald Byrne is an international master, a very strong international master at that. And so a lot of you may see this and say, you know, Bobby Fischer should win this game easily, but you have to keep in mind that this game was actually played when Bobby Fischer was 13 years old. So as we kind of go over the moves and analyze them and come up with some of the thoughts behind some of Bobby Fischer's move, it's going to be just mind-blowing to think that a 13-year-old can come up with some of the stuff that Bobby Fischer was coming up with in this game. As we go along, you'll see some of the great ideas, but at the same time, this game has not only one of the best moves in chess history, but also one of the greatest sacrifices in chess history. So if you haven't already seen this game, it's going to be a real treat. If you have, I still think it'll be, you know, really great for you to go back and look at some of the great moves and analyze them and go over some of the commentary that we're going to be discussing today. Byrne, playing the white pieces, started with knight to f3, simple development move, trying to control the center, and Bobby Fischer responded with knight to f6, again just mirroring the move here. From here, Byrne played pawn to c4, trying to gain a little bit control of the center, and Bobby Fischer responded with pawn to g6, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop to this g7 square. Bobby Fischer elected to play hyper-modern defense, trying to control the center with his minor pieces, and not really getting his pawns involved in the center control of the game until later on. Byrne decided to bring his knight to c3, simple development move, again at the same time controlling the center of the board, and Bobby Fischer continued with bishop to g7. Byrne from here played pawn to d4, again trying to control the center, and Bobby Fischer castled on the king side. Now the next move was kind of surprising, not because it was a bad move, but just because at this time in chess, it was very common for white to play pawn to e4. This is the King's Indian defense. But Byrne really gave a lot of respect to Bobby Fischer. Even though he was 13 years old, it was well known that he really understood a lot of the book lines and really understood the theory behind them. Bobby Fischer spent a lot of time studying the game of chess. And so Byrne, instead of opting to play a defense, the King's Indian defense that he knew Bobby Fischer was really, you know, well in depth at, that he decided instead to go with a line that made sense as far as opening principle with bishop to f4, but he thought that maybe Bobby Fischer wasn't really, you know, as studied up on this, and then he thought that, you know, being a stronger player by title international master, that this would allow him to, you know, play a little bit out of Fischer's strong suit and have a better game here. From here, Bobby Fischer played pawn to d5. This is the Grunfeld defense. And from here, white decided to bring his queen to b3. And this is the Russian system, so if you want to read up a little bit on that, but really getting his queen involved, really trying to put a lot of pressure on not only this d5 pawn here, but into the center in general. He's trying to really gain center control with this move here. Bobby Fischer, as far as, you know, his move options, he doesn't have a lot of good moves. Pawn to c4 is definitely the best move. It does give up the center for right now, but it does take away a tempo from the white queen here, because the white queen is going to have to recapture and lose a move here. So after the white queen recaptures, then Bobby Fischer brings his pawn to c6. And this is kind of a waiting move. It's trying to not allow white to move up the board anymore. And keep in mind, anytime you see a player, especially in the Grunfeld defense, if they're going to bring their pawn to c6 here, more times than not they're going to sometime soon bring their knight to d7 here. So that's kind of what Bobby Fischer's thinking in the back of his head. From here, Byrne continued to put all the pieces in place where he wants to. He's bringing his pawn now to e4. This does a few things. One, it allows his light square bishop to get out of the action, get developed, so he can castle on the king side for further king safety. And at the same time, it's a really good square. Bobby Fischer was really allowing white to just completely dominate the center of the board right now. And so Byrne just, you know, taking what's given to him. He has the center of the board, so he's just taking that from here. As we talked about before, Bobby Fischer had planned on bringing his knight to d7. Very common move as far as development. He later on is going to get this knight, you know, kicked off to a different square, but for now this is a completely fine square. And from here, Byrne decided to bring his rook to d1. You always want to put your rooks behind pawns as they push up the board, and so this is a logical move to bring his rook to d1. Now keep in mind that his queen was here before, so this knight here on f3 at some point could be pinned down with the bishop on g4. Once this queen went away from d1, the pin could no longer be there, but now that the rook is here on d1, we may see a pin later on down the road with the bishop to g4 here. Now from here, Bobby Fischer decided to bring his knight to b6. Again, gaining a tempo, this queen's going to have to move here. Obviously, he's being attacked. And so, yes, Bobby Fischer is moving his minor piece twice. You never want to move one of your pieces twice unless you have a good reason for it. And one of those reasons is to gain a tempo. So, Bobby Fischer, although he moved this twice, is not going to lose a move since the queen has to move. And from here, Byrne decided to bring his queen to c5. Now, this is a pretty aggressive move. A lot of analysts that look at this say that it would have been a little safer just to bring the queen back to b3. Again, white has complete control of the center right here. He has a slight advantage, and it would be completely okay to bring his queen back to b3. But Byrne decided to play a little bit aggressive here and decided to bring his queen to c5. There's no real strong attack right now, but he just doesn't want to play passive right now against Bobby Fischer. From here, Bobby Fischer, like all great chess players, continued his development by bringing his last minor piece into the game, and he brought his bishop to g4. Now, this is a very aggressive move, and as we talked about before, he's pinning this knight down to the rook here on d1 that was brought over from a1. And, we can go through the entire game and talk about, what great moves were made, what bad moves were made, but I think one of the worst moves in the game was the next move by Byrne. And Byrne played bishop to g5. Now the problem with this is white really needs to, one, finish his development. He needs to get his light square bishop into the game. Bringing his bishop to e2 not only destroys the pin with his knight on f3, but at the same time it allows his king to castle on the king side, have king safety, and at the same time white has a really good setup. What this move to g5 does is, one, it wastes tempo. He's already moved his bishop to f4, and again, as we talked about, you don't want to move your minor pieces twice unless you have a good reason. In my mind, there's not a good reason to bring your bishop to g5, only except to say, you're pinning down my knight, I want to try to pin down your knight. If you ever move your e-pawn, I'm pinning down your knight to your queen. But it just doesn't do as much as it should, and at the same time, Bobby Fischer has his king castled. He has complete safety and all his minor pieces are developed. White over here has a good game. If he would just continued his development, the game would have gone completely different. But, that's what chess is, and this mistake was made, bishop to g5. And now from here, black had one of the greatest moves that people say, chess has ever seen. So if you haven't seen this game, if you want to go ahead and pause, see if you can come up with, Bobby Fischer's next move. I'm going to highly doubt that you do, but hey, if you're some sort of chess genius and you come up with this move, that'd be fantastic. But the move is knight to a4. Now this move was only made by Bobby Fischer because Byrne played his bishop to g5. If Byrne would have continued his development with bishop to e2 and then castled on the king side, this move to knight to a4 would not have been as great, and the plan that Bobby Fischer had would not have been able to evolve like it did. But in this case, Bobby Fischer knew two things. He knew that the king was not safe, and at the same time, he knew that his pawn on e4 was very, very weak. If he could take this pawn out, then he could really have a strong attack on the king side, because the king right now is not safe. So what he noticed is the defender of this pawn on e4 is this knight here on c3. So he is coming down here, and it looks like he is sacrificing his knight on a4 so that he can gobble up this pawn on e4. Now keep in mind here, white is not able to right away take this knight on a4, and Bobby Fischer had to do a lot of calculation, and Byrne, in his own right, had to do a lot of calculation because he actually decided to decline this knight here on a4 because he saw there was really no good move for him in the continuation. If he takes on a4, obviously Bobby Fischer is going to bring his knight and take on e4. And really there's three continuations that white could have here. One of them being if he brings his queen to e7, and then the queen comes down to a5 from Bobby Fischer, attacking the king. The pawn could come to b4 after this knight's taken, and this knight's taken, then the rook could come to e7 if the bishop comes to e7 to block. Then after this trade-off right here, then the bishop could come back to f4, and this is, to f8, and this is going to be very good. Obviously, white cannot hold on to all this material, and at the same time, look at this pawn structure for white. It's just not very good, and as you can see for Bobby Fischer, he has great pawn structure, and everything's pretty much coordinating together, and at the same time, you know, the king from white is still on e1 and it's still unprotected. So that's not going to be a good variation. At the same time, if we go back, instead of taking with the queen, if Byrne decided to take with his bishop on e7, then after, you know, Bobby Fischer takes the queen and Byrne takes the queen, the knight on a4 is going to be gobbled up, and then the bishop's going to come back to g5, and then after the trade-off here, as you can see right here, the material is the same. Bobby Fischer could continue and take this pawn on b2, but as you can see, as far as material-wise, Bobby Fischer is completely fine. He's up a pawn in material, and at the same time, the pawn structure is completely obliterated for Byrne, and Bobby Fischer still has his pawn structure intact. So those are two, and the last one that people have analyzed is if he brings his knight to e4, then the queen could come down to c1, but if his queen comes down to c1, then obviously Bobby Fischer could come into a5. Now the rook could come over, the knight could come to c3, and after the bishop comes to f3 and the exchange happens on f3, then the knight could come kick back over and capture on g5. As you can see right here, black is equalized as far as the material, but at the same time we still have this problem with the pawn structure very weak for white, and at the same time he still is not castled and his king is still out in the open. So in this situation, Byrne actually decided to decline the knight on a4, even though it looks like Bobby Fischer's just giving it up. Byrne looked at the variations and saw, you know, even though he's giving this up, down the road this is not going to be good for me. So, you know, when you see that Byrne plays, you know, queen to a3, that's kind of why, if you look at it and you say, you know, why didn't he just take on a4? Well, that's why he didn't take on a4. So Bobby Fischer continued with his plan. He captured the knight here on c3, again trying to remove this defender of the e4 pawn. Now keep in mind, Byrne has two options. He can capture with his pawn or he can capture with his queen, but he knows that really Bobby Fischer wants to come in and take this pawn on e4, and once he does this, then this pawn on e7 is going to be hanging. So right now he doesn't want to take with his queen because he wants two attackers, his queen on a3 and his bishop on g5, to both be attacking this pawn here on e7. So just keep in mind that Byrne does take with his pawn, you know, from b2, but that's why, if you're wondering why didn't he take with his queen, that's exactly why. But from here, Bobby Fischer continued with his plan, taking with his knight on from f6 to e4. And again, as we talked about before, it was not a free pawn because now Byrne was able to bring his bishop to e7. From here, Bobby Fischer, with his queen being attacked, he brought his queen to b6, starting to really form a strong attack against the white king here. And as you can see, white in this situation decided that he really needs to get, you know, safety for his king, or he's going to be in a lot of trouble. So what he did, he should have done a long time ago. He developed his light square bishop and he brought it to c4 here. Now keep in mind, he probably should have developed this a long time ago, but it is good that he decided that he wanted to now get some safety for his king, since Bobby Fischer is starting to really put a lot of pressure on the white king for white. Bobby Fischer now decided to bring his knight to c3 and capture. Now keep in mind that the queen is not going to be able to recapture here on c3, because now the rook could come over to e8 and is pinning this bishop down to the king on e1. So if you're like, why didn't he just recapture? That's exactly why. And in this situation, Bobby Fischer would have won material. So instead, Byrne brought his bishop back to c5. Now, if you haven't seen this game, go ahead and take a minute and think about what black should do as far as his plan going forward in this game. From here, Bobby Fischer played rook to e8. Again, kind of an in-between move, putting the check on the king. The king decided to move to f1. Now keep in mind, he really couldn't come to d2, because from here the knight could come back to e4, check the king. Once the king moves back to c1, then the bishop could come to h6, again putting a lot of pressure. If the king now moves to c2, then the knight's going to come back here and take this bishop on c5, really just losing a bishop here, or losing material. So that's not going to work. So instead, after the rook comes to e8, Byrne decided to play king to f1, which seems logical enough. Again, he's still putting pressure on this queen on b6. He knows that Bobby Fischer's probably going to play his queen somewhere, so he's just kind of waiting here. But Bobby Fischer had other things in plan, and he played what a lot of people perceive to be the greatest sacrifice in chess history, and he brought his bishop to e6. Now, if you came up with this move, I don't believe you, because I looked at this game a long time. You may be a better chess player than I am, but there's no way that I'm playing e6 in this chess game. But Bobby Fischer is better at chess than I am, and he did play it. Even at 13, he was better than I will ever be. So he played bishop to e6, and Byrne decided to go ahead and take the queen. Again, if you have a queen, you know, it's pretty hard not to take. So he went ahead and took the queen, and then Bobby Fischer went ahead and played bishop to c4, and then just started a windmill tactic and just started gobbling up all of Byrne's pieces. So from here, the king has to come back to g1. It's kind of forced, and so the knight comes to e2. Again, this is the windmill effect. The king's going to have to come back to f1. He gobbles up this pawn here on d4. The king goes back. He brings the knight back. The king comes back to f1. He now brings his knight to c3, attacking this rook here on d1. The king has to go back. Again, he continues to be put in check by this bishop here on c4, and he can't come back to the e-file because this rook is so nicely placed from on e8. Now from here is a great move. He plays pawn takes to b6, and what this does is, one, it takes another minor piece, but at the same time it's gaining another tempo because it's now not only attacking, capturing this piece on b6, but he's attacking the queen on a3. From here, Byrne played queen to b4. Again, not a lot of options that he has here. And Bobby Fischer brought his rook down to a4. Now, you can start to see all of Bobby Fischer's pieces are really starting to, work together. This bishop here on g7 has this long diagonal covered, holding down, protection on this knight. The knight's protecting the rook's protecting the bishop. So all of his pieces are kind of working together. Whereas you can see for white, his king's over here on g1. His rook on h1 is not doing anything, and none of his pieces are really connected or doing anything. So you can really see, even though Bobby Fischer gave up a queen, all of his pieces are working really well together. Now, after he starts to attack the queen comes to b6, trying to gobble up some material, but at the same time, it's still kind of lost right here. Bobby Fischer now decides to come in and take this rook on d1. And now Byrne decides that he really needs to get his king out of the way. His king really can't move, and so, a lot of threats that Bobby Fischer has, he can come down and checkmate, once he starts to take some pieces off the board. So he knows that he needs to really start to try to counterattack and really get somewhere for his king to go here. So he plays pawn to h3. And from here, Bobby Fischer decides to go ahead and take this pawn on a2. Doesn't really want to have to worry about any pawns on the queen side, so now he can pretty much focus all his attention on the king side. Byrne decided to continue and get his king to some safety. He brings his king to h2 here, and Bobby Fischer continues to gobble up more and more material, bringing his knight to f2. And from here, Byrne decided that he really needed to do something with this rook on h1. It hasn't done anything all game, and so he decided to bring it to e1 and trade off these rooks here, because he knows that this rook on e8 has been a pain, putting a lot of pressure, and at the same time, it's kind of a way that he can free up an attack with his queen on the black king here from Bobby Fischer on g8. So after the rook comes down to e1, Byrne now plays his queen to d8. Now Bobby Fischer has two ideas. He could either, one, bring his rook to e8, or he could instead block with his bishop on f8. And I think Bobby Fischer chose the better of the two moves, and he played bishop to f8. He knows he's going to lose his rook either way, but by doing his bishop here on f8, once Byrne plays knight takes on e1, as you can see, his knight is really far away from the action. And that was a super smart move from Bobby Fischer, because he knows if you're going to trade, you might as well have your opponent, have his minor pieces as far away from the action as possible. There's no real way for this knight here on e1 and this queen here on d8 to really, attack together unless it's 3, 4, 5 moves down the road, where Bobby Fischer can easily get all his moves, all his pieces developed exactly how he wants to and kind of work together very seamlessly. And that's exactly what Bobby Fischer starts to do. He first brings his bishop to d5, centralizing his bishop. Obviously, bishops work well in the center where they can kind of attack the entire board. And at the same time, he's really starting to get all his pieces so that they can all kind of work together. So that's his first move, and from here, Byrne decided to bring his knight back to f3. Again, his knight can't do anything on e1, so he wants to try to get it back into the game. Bobby Fischer now plays his knight to f4. Again, pretty much all of his pieces are now protected, except one, and that takes place in the next move. And the queen now comes to b8, and Bobby Fischer plays pawn to b5. And as you can see here, if you look at all the pieces, this rook here on a2 is protected by the bishop. The bishop is protected by the pawn. All of the pieces are really working, well together, and there's not a lot that Byrne has here as far as counterplay. I mean, what does he really do here? You're just kind of waiting to see what Bobby Fischer's really going to do, because you can't do much with just one queen dancing all over the board. Byrne decided to play h4, trying to get some sort of counterplay on the king side. Bobby Fischer said, all my pieces are completely developed how I want them to. I'm going to play h5 as kind of a waiting move, and just to let you know, I'm not going to allow you to do anything else on the king side. So Byrne really doesn't have any moves with his queen, so he decides to get his knight involved into the game, bringing his knight to a central square e5, trying to put some sort of pressure. And now Bobby Fischer decides that he no longer wants to have his king pinned down, so he brings his king to g7 at the same time, allowing his bishop free. Since his bishop's no longer pinned, his bishop, if he wants to later on, can come down to d6, have a brilliant pin on this knight. Can't do anything. Obviously, he can't take with his bishop from b8 because the knight here from e4 would be protecting this square on d6. So Byrne saw this, and he's going to have to retreat his king. He cannot lose any more material, and he definitely does not want to have his only minor piece left pinned down to the king. So he decides to bring his king down to g1, and now Bobby Fischer plays bishop to c5, checking the king here. And now is just really a mating pattern. There's really not a lot that Byrne could do here. He does bring his king to f1. Bobby Fischer now brings his knight to g3, and again he's just pretty much going to march Byrne all the way down the firing line, and then have a nice little checkmate at the end here. So Byrne obviously can't come to the second rank because of the rook. Obviously, a rook on the second rank is always dangerous, and kind of shows one reason why here. And he can't retreat back to g1, obviously, because the bishop here on c5, so he has to continue down the board on e1. And now Bobby Fischer played bishop to b4, and again he has to continue to march down. It's a forced move, he has no other options. And Bobby Fischer now plays bishop to b3, forced move to c1. Now he brings his knight back into the action. He's now forced again to come to b1. And now, after his knight comes to c3, then it's going to be checkmate in 1. After the king comes back to c1, then the rook comes to c2 and it's checkmate. So a brilliant game by Bobby Fischer. He really showed, even sacrificing his queen, he knew that he could really use all of his minor pieces, cohesively and dominate the game. Once all his pieces were working together, and white, even though he had the queen, was kind of scattered, none of his pieces were working together, that Bobby Fischer knew that that was the correct move. So fantastic sacrifice from Bobby Fischer. Fantastic game played by a 13-year-old. I don't even know how you play chess at 13 like that, but hope you guys enjoyed this game. It is the game of the century because it was so fantastic. If you haven't checked out the website, make sure you do that, www.thechesswebsite.com, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.